Welcome to this virtual hereditary cancer seminar and panel discussion. We are so happy to have so many people joining us tonight. Through meaningful collaboration and a sense of purpose, the Jewish communities in Contra, Costa, and Pleasanton have come together with Sharsheret, the UCSF Center for Brca Research, and John Muir Health's Genetic Counseling Department to create what we hope will be an educational seminar and informative panel discussion on Bracha for men and women. We thank the organizers and co-sponsors, Anshe Isaiah, Beth Haim Congregation, B'nai Israel of Rossmore, Chabad of Contra Costa, Congregation Beth Emet, Congregation B'nai Shalom, Congregation B'nai Tikva, Contra Costa JCC, Contra Costa Jewish Day School, Diablo Valley Hadassah, Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County, John Muir Health, National Council of Jewish Women, Sharsheret, Temple Isaiah, UCSF Center for Brca Research, and Women of Isaiah. Working together, may we continue to move from strength to strength. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the program, Amy Sachs, the California Program Coordinator for Sharsheret.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and thank you so much to the amazing consortium of Contra Costa community partners for hosting this program. I have never worked with this many program sponsors before and community partners, and it has been amazing to get to know you all. And thank you in particular to the committee of dedicated volunteers, all of whom have been working since November of last year to bring Sharsheret to your community. And we have over 200 people registered tonight, so your work has not gone unnoticed. Thank you so much to all of you and to everyone here for joining us. So Sharsheret, for those of you who don't know, is the National Jewish Breast and Ovarian Cancer Community. We are here for non-Jews as well. We are in all 50 states. So if you go away with one thing, please know that we are here for everybody. We provide free, confidential, and personalized support before, during, and after diagnosis. And so we're really here for everyone, whether they're just considering genetic testing, whether they've gotten genetic testing done, or have an actual diagnosis, whether it's a genetic mutation or a cancer diagnosis, whether they're a caregiver from near or far, or whether they're 10 years or more into survivorship. We're here for everyone. We have a team of social workers, a genetic counselor, and educational staff here to support you and your community in whatever ways we can with our programs, outside resources, and more. This evening, we'll be discussing the latest information surrounding the relationship with the Jewish community and our risk for cancer, but we will also touch on the risk for the general public as well. We'll be discussing hereditary cancer focusing on the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene mutations, which greatly increase the risk of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer, male breast cancer, and melanoma, and disproportionately impacts the Jewish community, especially people of Ashkenazi ancestry. We will also touch on other gene mutations associated with other cancers as well. So if you're comfortable, for anyone who is still sharing their screen, please raise your hand if you've had a friend diagnosed with cancer. And you can keep it raised. Raise your hand if you have a family member who's been diagnosed with cancer. And keep your hand raised, and now raise your hand if you yourself have been diagnosed with cancer. So you can see from the amount of hands raised that this is a conversation that every family, and specifically every Jewish family, should be having. So without further ado, our esteemed panel tonight includes Dr. Pamela Munster, who is a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. We're at the Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center. She's the leader of Experimental Therapeutics Program, director of Early Phase Clinical Trials Unit, and co-director of the UCSF Center for BRCA Research. Her lab explores new ways to detect and cure BRCA-related cancer. She also develops strategies to treat patients as an oncologist. She serves on local, national, and international committees focused on developing new treatments. She's published articles, textbooks, as a frequent lecturer. As a native of Switzerland, she leads breast cancer awareness campaigns across the globe. And she herself was diagnosed with a BRCA2 mutation in 2012 and found that there was no easy place to coordinate her care. So she set out to create the UCSF Center for BRCA Research in partnership with Dr. Alan Ashworth. By transcending the doctor-patient perspective, she epitomizes the personal, patient-centered care that is a hallmark of the UCSF Medical Center. She also authored Twisting Fate about her experience as an oncologist and cancer patient. Josh Barnhart is an oncology genetic counselor at John Muir Health. He received his bachelor's in genetics and genomics from UC Davis and his master's degree in genetic counseling from Virginia Commonwealth University. He was born and raised in the Northern California area and is passionate about helping each individual patient learn about the complexities of their hereditary cancer risk and providing them with support through their hereditary cancer journey. Raleigh Zwerin grew up in the Bay Area, where she now lives with her husband and 2 teenage children. She taught first grade for many years and now runs a master's credentialing program for elementary teachers based out of Oakland. Tonight, she'll share her personal story with us. So what's the format for this evening? First, we'll hear from our panelists and then we'll open it up for questions. Some of you already sent in questions, so thank you for those. I have those. If you think of a question during our event, please feel free to write it into the chat. You can write it in publicly where it says everyone at the top, or you can click on my name or on Sharsheret's name and ask the question privately. Just to me, and we will try to get through as many as we can, but because we had so many submitted beforehand, I'm sure that we will have some left over. So just know that we will still try to answer everyone's questions after the event, and I'll be following up with an email in the next week or two with answers to the rest of your questions. So I'm going to keep this evening moving along. So without further ado, let's get started. So Raleigh, let's start with you. And if you can please tell us how you learned about BRCA mutations.
About my own personal mutation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when it was 6 years ago, and I was walking out of synagogue on Rosh Hashanah with my son and my daughter and my husband. And that is when the genetic counselor called in the way as we were walking to the car to tell me that I was BRCA1 positive. It was a mutation that I was not surprised that I had. It was because my sister had also just learned that she was BRCA1 positive. And it was the second test that she had taken. She took a test to find out 5 years earlier. And she learned from that first test that she took the test originally because she went to through a girlfriend, gave her the genetic test for free. It was a girlfriend who worked for a genetic testing company, and that girlfriend gave her the test, and she got the results of that test online. They were digital results, and she looked at the results and didn't really see anything unusual or alarming about what she noticed online. And we didn't even really know that that original test was testing for the BRCA mutation. And so it wasn't until the actress Angelina Jolie came out with her story, she's also BRCA1 positive, that my sister and I decided to go to our own doctors to ask if we should be tested. And, our maternal grandmother, my mom's mom, died when my mom was just 1 year old of breast cancer. And we're both Ashkenazi Jews. And so when we asked our doctors, the doctors said, no, actually, that we weren't candidates, that both of our parents were perfectly healthy and there was no need for us to be tested. So we didn't really think about it again. And it wasn't until my sister decided to get her dog tested for a DNA test. She had a mutt and she wanted to see what kind of dog she had, that she kind of remembered the first genetic test that she had actually taken. And she pulled those results up again online and looked at them. And at the very top of the page, for the very first time, they were the same digital results that she had received, but this time it said BRCA1 positive at the very top of the page, written in red. So she got retested. That was her second test. And again, confirmed that she was positive. My brother was negative. And we assumed that, of course, this mutation came from my mom because her own mother had died at such a young age of breast cancer. But this mutation didn't come from her. It came from my dad. And my dad is one of 3 brothers. His dad was one of 3 brothers. We didn't really realize that there was, the mutation would have come from him or there was really any risk, because all of the men in his family, some did die of cancer, but they did at an older age. So we were surprised by those results.
Absolutely. It's such a riveting story and all the twists and turns. So we'll come back to you for a little bit more of it in a little bit. Dr. Munster, can you tell us a little bit about the general population risk for cancer?
You mean like not in someone with a hereditary cancer?
Exactly, just the general population, and if there's relationship between age and cancer risk.
Yeah, you know, and people, please forgive me. I'm a professor and I quickly start lecturing. So if it gets boring and unwieldy, let me know. But I think the important part is in breast cancer is quite common. About 1 in 8 women at some point upon her life will be affected with breast cancer. Ovarian cancer, on the other hand, is not that common. What's different for someone with a hereditary cancer is twofold. One is like women with Brca mutation tend to have cancer a little bit earlier in life, and there's often more breast cancer in the family. And in my, what I find really important to know, and that's why I'm here and find it so important that people get reminded they could have a hereditary mutation. If Raleigh and I had known that we had a mutation, we probably would start screening much sooner. So when I was diagnosed with breast cancer at 48, first of all, I didn't think I had enough breast that I could actually have cancer. And I was, of course, reminded that this is not the case. But the reality is, like, there was no reason for me to believe that I would be at risk for breast cancer. My mutation comes from my father, and he was a single child, and his mother had breast cancer, but she was older, so this was not considered. In my mom's family, there's no breast cancer. So I think the take-home message is really, if I'd known, I would probably be more prepared, and I would have taken more precautions. And I think that's the difference. And then the hereditary mutation, as we talk a little bit later, and I hope to hear from Josh as well, is also associated with other cancers that
yes,
are more important to prevent.
Yes, we will definitely be talking a lot about that tonight. So perfect segue, Josh. What is the risk for being a carrier of the BRCA gene mutation, and how does the risk for being a carrier change for a member of the Ashkenazi Jewish population?
Yeah, that's a really important question as well. So oftentimes the number, you can look up, it varies a little bit, but for individuals of just the general population, oftentimes that risk is quoted around 1 in 300 to about 1 in 500. So it is still relatively rare, less than 1% even for someone of the general population to have a specific genetic change or a positive result within those BRCA genes, those BRCA genes. However, for individuals who are of the Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, individuals have a higher risk. It's about 1 in 40 for those to have a specific genetic change within those BRCA genes. So it is something that greatly elevates. It's almost a 10 times greater increased risk for those who are of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry versus those who are of the general population.
Absolutely, it's such a big difference. And why is that difference? Why is the Ashkenazi community at greater risk?
Yeah, and that's a good question as well. So oftentimes that comes down to, for individuals who are of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, they have specifically a higher risk to getting 3 specific genetic changes within the BRCA genes. They're oftentimes called founder mutations. And what a founder mutation is essentially when you take a small group of individuals, and oftentimes that small group of individuals is oftentimes due to either religious isolation or geographic isolation. Well, what can happen is as they populate over generations, there were specific rare mutations that were within that initial small population. Well, it can grow that as these generations go on, these rare mutations can be seen and more often in this population. So for individuals who are of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, well, most of them did come from initially what are called those founder individuals. Those founder individuals were a small group of population. And so we assume that, they interbred between them. And over time, these mutations that were relatively rare, but were within that small population became more common within that specific, like I said, Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, which leads to that higher risk than those of just, the general population.
Right.
So that's where that
in the family.
Yeah, so it comes from, yes, within the family, which is, why that higher risk is
Right.
compared to,
Right.
other individuals.
And Josh,
Maybe I can add something here. I think that's probably an important point because the Brca mutation or even ATM check don't actually impair fertility or manifest that early. You actually don't know mostly that your spouse may carry this mutation, right? There's another diseases where diseases manifest at younger age, and you would know that the family carries a gene. This will probably be eliminated. So, but this is what leads to the accumulation of this gene in families.
That's a great point. And like you both, already shared in your stories, if it's coming from, the father's side and it's a small family, then you're even less likely to see that. Josh, what do we know about risk levels in the Sephardic community?
That's also a good question. So we know that individuals who are the Sephardic Jewish population as well also can have genetic changes, not only within these Brca genes that we keep mentioning, but within other genes as well. We know that oftentimes though, because they don't come from that same population, that risk is still there. And so we still want to make sure that individuals who are of a Sephardic Jewish population still can get testing. But oftentimes the family history is more of an indicator to say, does it seem more likely or less likely? So it is something that population, is still at risk. It doesn't mean that they're not, but it is something that for individuals who are of Ashkenazi Jewish is typically still higher than those of the Sephardic Jewish population. But still something to absolutely be aware of given, the context of the family history, and something that it is still there, as we do know individuals who are of the Sephardic, Jewish population. Some of those individuals still have some of those founder mutations that are found within, the Ashkenazi Jewish population. So it is still something that be very important to be, keeping your eye on, asking questions, family history, getting to know about your family a little bit in terms of at least that, breast cancer, ovarian cancer risk, and these other cancers that we're going to go over as well later on. But something that, definitely something important to know. That risk isn't as high as, like I said, the Ashkenazi Jewish population, but something that still exists.
Right. So Dr. Munster, can you speak a little bit about what are these genes? What does the BRCA gene do? And what happens when they don't work correctly, when they have a mutation?
So BRCA1 and BRCA2 are populated in different chromosomes. If I can take you back to biology, one is on 17, the other one is on 13. Every one of you has two BRCA genes, two BRCA2, two BRCA1. Now, one of them can get abnormal, and there can be many, many spots. So there's about 6,000 or 7,000 abnormal BRCA mutations now. So there's many different versions of the Jewish community. Only have 3 that are very common, actually. But if you don't have one of the 3 commons, you could still have any of the others. So it's very easy to mutate this gene. Not every mutation causes cancer, and I think that's where some of the question comes from, is like, why does Ashkenazi Jewish members not only have a frequent gene, but also frequently have cancer? It does seem to appear that if you have a mutation, it does matter whether the gene expresses itself. We see Brca mutation in families, and there have very few cancers. We see Brca mutation in families, and everyone who has the mutation also seems to have cancer. So I think the mutation so this Brca mutation does not cause cancer, it puts you at risk for cancer. So having the mutation is not a test that tells you have cancer. It tells you that you're at risk for cancer. So if you go for genetic testing and you come back with a positive Brca mutation, does not mean you have cancer. I think a lot of time people under this misconception, they get a test and that test tells us whether you have cancer. You have a risk to get cancer, and then we like you to screen. So important part is Brca mutation. Probably the highest risk associated with Brca mutation is breast cancer. Second is ovarian cancer, but then pancreatic cancer for both men and women, and then also prostate cancer. Melanoma is a little bit less clear because melanoma is quite common in fair people. And so because melanoma is actually quite common and Brca mutation are common, it's not so clear whether you have a true link between melanoma and Brca mutation. And I think, Josh, you probably would agree, because skin screening is such an important part because it's such a preventable cancer. We try to sort of, like in our recommendation for hereditary screening, we like to slip in the the skin cancer screening because it's easy and it's very effective. But then BRCA mutation can cause other cancers or can be associated with other cancers. So it's often a cancer enabler. So we often see cholangiocarcinoma, which is associated with gallbladder, sometimes bladder, sometimes colon. There's a smattering of other cancers. We just have not quite as good an understanding how clearly they are linked.
Absolutely, thank you. And can you speak a little bit, Dr. Munster, about how BRCA gene mutations run in families and how often do they come through the male side of the family?
Well, the gene is passed on since you have two of them and usually one is mutated. Every offspring has a 50-50% chance of carrying the gene. So you can get the mutation from your father, like me, or you can get it from your mother, like others. It can come from either side, and I think it's really important to look at your father's side as well. And I think in the last years, the hereditary component from the fathers has often been overlooked. Of course, not like someone as in tune with this like Josh, but a lot of doctors have often just focused on and the mother side and not as much as those things. And if you just take one look around, it seems like the women are much more into the healthcare than men. If you just look at how many women are on the call compared to how many men, and I really, really like to give a shout out to all the men who call in. It's really important that we have the awareness from the male family members.
Absolutely, absolutely. I second that. Raleigh, can you tell us a little bit about how the conversation has gone, since you and your sister tested positive? What was the conversation like with the rest of the members of your family?
Well, my sister and I talk multiple times a day on an average day, embarrassingly sometimes about absolutely nothing at all. We just sit there in silence. But our conversations very early on when we first learned that we were BRCA positive were of course all centered around this mutation, what it meant. And we tried very quickly to get educated and learn about this mutation. And as Josh said, learned that as Ashkenazi Jews, our risk was 1 in 40. Doctors told us that we had a lifetime risk of more than 80% chance of getting breast cancer and over a lifetime risk of 40% of getting ovarian cancer. They told us that there were no really good screening options for ovarian cancer to detect it early, and that the screenings for breast cancer were better, but that it was much better to go in for surgery as somebody who was healthy versus somebody who wasn't well. So for us, the choice was just really clear. Each decision and conversation that we had was really multi-layered. Do we have breast reconstruction? Our implants, if we decide to get them, did they go under the muscle or over the muscle? And then our conversations really continued on and continue to this day about making sure that we are being monitored. We both have 2 kids, and we talk about that in the conversation. When should they be tested? We were told that they shouldn't, my daughter shouldn't be tested until she's in her mid-20s, and our son's a little bit later than that. And, the conversations really were about how we feel about, we felt very, I should say, blessed in many ways to sort of learn about this mutation when we were both still healthy, because we know that is really not the case for so many people who more often than not learn about this mutation when they are sick themselves. So often we just talk about how fortunate we feel that we learned when we had preventative options.
That's such a lovely way to look at it. I love that. Thank you. So Josh, can you tell everyone a little bit about how genetic testing is performed?
Yeah, so good question. So in terms of how it's performed, I mean, it can be done oftentimes two different ways nowadays. So we can either do a blood draw or a saliva test. So those are the distinction in terms of, how we can go about getting your DNA in terms of actually doing the genetic testing. But genetic testing is done in a lot of different settings nowadays. So sometimes it's when individuals, have this family history, or they know someone within their family who has, some genetic component. Maybe it's in one of these BRCA genes, for example, and they come in and do genetic testing in order to say, okay, do I have this? And if I do, well, let's make sure I'm being more proactive about it and I can take these preventative steps that are needed to do. Sadly, though, for some individuals, they don't do genetic testing until they actually have a cancer diagnosis. And for those individuals, it can be important, oftentimes if they have breast cancer, maybe for their surgical decision in terms of, do we recommend doing a double mastectomy versus, maybe just doing what's called a lumpectomy, sometimes called breast conserving surgery. So sometimes it comes down to, individuals who have this family history, they want to know more about it, and to, contextualize, is there some genetic component for that? And for other individuals, sadly, they're not able to go based off of that. It's because they actually have that cancer diagnosis to say, okay, well, now that this has happened and we know that there's this family history, well, let's make sure to see there is a genetic component, there's anything prophylactically that we'd recommend based off of that. But in terms of the actual genetic testing itself, like I said, at this point, it's currently two different options. It's either the blood draw or we can do a saliva test as well.
Thank you. And what age is best to go to undergo genetic testing?
Oh, that is a complicated question, that is for sure. So it could be a couple of different things. I think for, Raleigh's case, absolutely it is something that for daughters, for, women who have, a mother maybe who has a BRCA mutation, it is something that sometimes we may suggest, in their early 20s. And because of the early 20s, we say that because for BRCA specifically, we recommend starting breast MRI screening. So screening for breast cancer at the age of 25 for those who actually have, like I said, a genetic component within one of these BRCA genes. So oftentimes for females, we say, oftentimes in their younger 20s. For men, cancer screening is what we're most concerned about is for that prostate cancer. And that screening typically isn't recommended until the age of 40. However, with that being said, though, there are absolutely individuals who come in, at 18, 19, who still want to know, even though that they may not, recommend anything until the age of 25. So it is something where it's very dependent on, I think, every individual's choice of, when we may recommend doing it versus when we may not. It's just with the idea that we always say that for these, adult onset cancers, so specifically for these BRCA genes, these are adult onset cancers, we don't recommend doing genetic testing until someone's at least the age of 18. And that's because for that age of 18, well, they can properly consent to doing genetic testing. They can fully understand, well, why am I doing this genetic testing? How is it going to be useful? What am I going to do based off of these results? However, based off of that, you can start at 18 if you're someone who really wants to know right away. However, oftentimes, like I said, for females who, have some family, history, or they know, oftentimes we may say early 20s is a good time. However, at the same time, I always say every time is a great time for doing genetic testing. Ultimately, if you have a family history, it really doesn't matter whether you're 70 years old, 18 years old, 85 years old. It's always good information for you. It's always good information for the family. So sure, we might say there's a prime age because that's when we may start screening. But really what I would say is, any time is really a great time to learn about, your genetic risk and to learn more information about yourself and more information that could really benefit family members as well.
Knowledge is power. I love that.
Absolutely.
Dr. Munster, I think you wanted to say something about this as well.
Yeah, having a Brca mutation, and when my kids were young and I was first diagnosed with the Brca mutation, of course I just wanted to know whether they have it, right? And it's very tempting to test it. And I have a lab. I could have just taken my daughter's DNA, tested it, and of course and I thought, like, well, if I test her and I know, I would just keep this as a secret. And my friends would tell me that I can't keep a secret on a good day, so how would I keep this secret? But what I really feel very strongly about is that you let your kids find out when they're ready. And I think it's, as parents and and as family members, we put a lot of pressure on the kids to get tested. But I think there's probably better times and there's worse times. We start screening at 25, but we see very, very few women at 25 with breast cancer. Of course, they exist. But sometimes in the life of a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old, there's college, there's decision making, there's such an overwhelming onslaught of important and difficult decisions that maybe knowing about their Brca mutation is probably not the right time. It's really An important part of genetic counseling is that, we can screen someone without them knowing whether they have the mutation, and it's like, let people be ready. There's one thing that's probably worth knowing. If you have a mutation, you have a chance of passing it on. And so if you don't know, and if you were a Brca mutation carrier and your spouse is, and you have a child, there's 1 in 4 children have a chance of having Fanconi's anemia. So these children have really a bad disorder with the leukemia, and often resulting in pregnancy loss. So there's if your children marry someone from another significant family history, likely a Brca mutation, then probably be good to know before and do genetic prenatal testing. So there's the two important things. Like, one is like, you should let the kids find out themselves. But as I said, if there's 2 families with really significant family history, you probably want to do prenatal testing.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, we have lots and lots of questions, so I'm going to ask our panelists to try to keep it tight, because even more questions keep coming in, and it's really exciting. I know we have a lot we want to get to. Josh, if people have been tested in the past, let's say 5 or more years ago, have the tests changed significantly, and what should people consider if they want to get tested again?
That's like I said, some good questions today. Absolutely. So absolutely, and genetic testing does change actually on a pretty regular basis. So when we say genetic testing has changed, it's not that getting your DNA is any different or anything like that. It simply means that as time goes on, is that genetics is still a young field, and we're continuing to learn of new genes that are associated with cancer. So I always give the example, in clinic that oftentimes in 2005 we really only were testing for those Brca genes specifically, the ones we've talked most about today. However, as time's gone on, we've continued to learn of new genes that are associated with breast cancer, with ovarian cancer, with colon cancer, with a lot of different types of cancer. So oftentimes nowadays, we're doing testing called multi-gene panel testing. And what that means is that we're oftentimes testing multiple different genes that are associated with a variety of different cancers to say, okay, we know these Brca genes are the most common genes associated with a genetic cause for breast cancer. But there are actually other genes that are associated with a genetic cause for getting breast cancer, for getting ovarian cancer, for these other cancers as well. So I always say that if you had genetic testing 5 years ago, it's important to bring up with whoever ordered that testing to say, okay, what were these genes that I were looked for? Has there been any new genes that we've recently found to say, okay, should we be testing for these other additional genes then? And that's because what I tell people is, you can always get a negative result. And a negative result is oftentimes, it is the good news. It's what a lot of people hope for when they're doing genetic testing. But a negative result doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some genetic component that could explain that family history. It always could be that simply we just don't know what's going on genetically at this point, and we could find something in the future. So my suggestion, like I said, if you've done it 5 years ago, it is something that, just talking about who ordered that testing, what do we recommend doing, anything additional? Have we learned of anything new at that time? So it's definitely always something to, be considering of as time goes on, we're only going to continue to learn more and more genes that are associated with these cancers as well.
Thank you. That's so helpful. Dr. Munster, can you talk a little bit about, for people who have a strong family history, but then test negative for the Brca gene mutation? So Josh just mentioned, there are other genetic mutations. Can you give a little bit of an overview of the most common gene mutations that can lead to these cancers?
Yeah, there was actually an interesting, there was 2 interesting publications just recently coming out, looking at 100,000 women and 60,000 women. It's like, what is the most common genes in breast cancer? And not surprising, BRCA1 and BRCA2 rank very high. But then there's a ATM mutation and a CHEK2 mutation and PALB2, which also are known to be pretty significantly associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. So if we quote women with a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, anywhere between 60 to 80% risk of breast cancer over a lifetime. For CHEK2 and ATM, this is probably somewhere 20 to 40%. So we call them moderate cancer genes. But if you have a 40% risk for breast cancer over a lifetime, we still think this is fairly high, that we start screening earlier than we would in a woman without a significant risk. And then is PALB2, which is the partner localizer for BRCA2, which is probably less common, but associated with fairly significantly increased risk for breast cancer. Some of us call this lovingly BRCA3, but and I think these are the major mutations. TP53, which is Li-Fraumeni syndrome, is also associated with very young breast cancer, but the mutation is quite rare, so we don't see this. But overall, we think about 5% there's about 5% of mutation that contribute to breast cancer. So it's actually having a breast cancer mutation is probably a little bit more common than we thought. We thought like it's 1 in 200, but if you take all the mutations together, it's probably about 1 in 50, or like even more.
Wow. And so, Dr. Munster, when should people be considering genetic testing? If they have no family history, if they aren't currently facing a cancer diagnosis, does it make sense for them to get tested?
So glad you asked me this, and like and I know that not everyone agrees with me. It's like I mean, you've before said knowledge is power, right? So I would have never qualified anywhere for any testing because I don't have enough family. So family history assessment is really good if you have a lot of family members. But what if you don't? What if you have your father has one brother and your mother has no siblings? How would you even assess your family history? What if your parents don't live long enough to assess whether they have a risk for breast cancer? My point is, like, I would test any woman because I do not want to see another woman with a big tumor walking into my clinic that could have been prevented. Mm-hmm. But not everyone feels like we should have this much knowledge. So I think it's the question of the future. I would suggest, however, if you want to find out about your BRCA status, don't do 23andMe.
I hear that. We're definitely going to talk a little bit about that. But since you brought it up, if you'd like to speak a little bit about, what quality are the over-the-counter testing options. I know that some of them are medical grade, some of them might not be. So, that the 23andMe test is very good. If you're an Ashkenazi Jewish person and you have one of the 3 founder mutation and you have a Brca mutation by 23andMe, it is real, okay? If you're like me, I'm not of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage, the 23andMe does not test for my mutation. So they reported my breast cancer risk as normal and my BRCA mutation as negative. Obviously, that's not accurate. There's a disclaimer in 23andMe, they are not intentionally misleading. But we give you an analogy, but what if you did a pregnancy test and it only would turn positive if you're Jewish? How would this be an acceptable pregnancy test? So this is the problem with 23andMe. So the problem is they're really only testing for 3 mutations, and for BRCA 1 and 2, they're probably now about 6,000 mutations around. Yes. Well, thank you for that. So Dr. Munster, can you talk a little bit about what options do people have when they do test positive for a BRCA mutation?
I think the most important part is when you learn that the day you're here, don't panic, because that doesn't mean that day you will have that your cancer risk starts the next day, even though I'm sure, Raleigh, that's exactly how everyone feels, right? You learn about your mutation and you immediately think your cancer risk is right around the corner. Of course, if you have a cancer and then you learn that you also have BRCA mutation, then that has implication on the treatment, so it's important. But I think the reason why we built the BRCA Center for Research is for people to actually have someone to go talk to. And I think that's why our genetic counselors are so important. This is the time you sit down with Josh and Josh walks you through what are the screenings, what are the recommendations, what are the next steps. And then more important than anything is that we do a lot of screening, but what happens if you had a mammogram in June and it was totally normal and an MRI in December, but in February you find a lump? Who do you call? I think that's what I see is so much still a problem is people find something and they just don't have anyone to call. And then it takes 2-3 months until they they organize the physician's visit, and then it gets forgotten, and then 6 months later someone comes with a very large tumor that probably would be much smaller 6 months from now. I think the important part is if you had a meeting with Josh and 3 months later you call him and said, oh my God, I have a lump, Josh is probably going to say you need to go see Dr. X, right? If you call us, we guide you. But I think the important part is not to disregard new lumps and findings on your body.
And can you tell us a little bit about increased surveillance and prophylactic measures?
Yeah, so for in someone with a BRCA 1 or 2 mutation at 25, we start doing MRIs, and then at some point we add mammograms. This is a bit less certain. We start talking about ovarian cancer screening and prophylaxis by 35, or when women have completed their childbearing. I said this is not that easy to go into menopause at very young age, but there's an option of providing some hormone replacement therapy, which actually is quite safe even in BRCA mutation carriers. And then for men, we start doing prostate screening probably at 40. I personally feel very strongly about colonoscopies because colon cancer is a very preventable tumor when it's diagnosed early as a polyp. I think it's important to do melanoma screening. And then, as I said, more important than anything is like, if you have a finding, call someone. Like just that's just
absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.
Josh, did I forget anything?
The last thing I would just add is in terms of the pancreatic cancer screening is that is something that is relatively new in terms of us doing the pancreatic cancer screening as well, to simply say that there is this elevated risk as well. So oftentimes for individuals who have, a BRCA1, BRCA2, genetic mutation, and then also have a family history, well, we oftentimes talk about, doing potential screening as well, which is something that was exciting because 10 years ago we weren't, doing, as much pancreatic cancer screening, where something that's become much more prevalent in the last couple of years, especially. So something that's the last thing, but otherwise I think absolutely I appreciate the
it's amazing
to actually bringing this up because this is actually quite controversial, and I feel quite strongly that we start screening. And right now the screening recommendations are only for people with BRCA2 mutation with family history. So, but I don't think there's enough evidence that BRCA1 is not a risk factor. So we started doing a study for BRCA mutation carriers over 50 to get MRIs on study. So I think we would really like to get. I really like to get that data. There's a lot of unknowns in the pancreatic cancer screening. And
absolutely. So Raleigh, can you please tell us what measures you have taken, and tell us what that experience means to you?
My sister and I both decided to have bilateral mastectomies, and we decided to have what's called a salpingo oophorectomy to have our ovaries and fallopian tubes removed. We each had 2 surgeries. We staggered them so that we could be there to take care of each other, and that our parents and families, who are most of them local Bay Area people, were there to also take care of us. The decision was an easy one in many ways for us, just because it felt like the evidence was so overwhelming that there was a really big risk that we would get sick. And we decided that it was really important that we took these preventative measures. But I will say that decision was made far easier because we both had partners, we had already had our children, and we were sort of closer in age to when we would naturally go into menopause. And also it was just made easier because we had this tremendous support from our families, from our partners, from our parents, who all really agreed that this was the right decision for us to make.
I love how you always have that positive spin to put on things, and really focused on, the gratitude and all of that of the situation. And also highlighted that that's not easy for other people, and that other people are going to make the choices that are right for them. I think that's something that I talk about all the time with our Sharsheret callers, because I speak to people who, similarly have a sibling that's diagnosed and is making a different choice than theirs, and how that family dynamic can be very difficult. So I'm so sorry you had to go through this, but I'm so glad that you had all of that support. And it sounds like your family really, really came together. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. We've already kind of touched on, different screening for different cancers. So thank you for that. We've also talked a little bit about how much things have changed in the past few years. So we hope that that continues. We hear all the time, how can things be different for our children? So Dr. Munster, what new screening technologies are in the research pipeline? You talked a little bit about research you want to see. What work is being done on BRCA mutation prevention as well?
The couple of things, is that the group in Philadelphia, they're working on a vaccine. Not ready for prime time yet, but hopefully getting there at some point. There's a lot of early diagnostics in terms of the circulating tumor cells, meaning like a tiny piece of the tumor floats through your blood and we can pick up by DNA for earlier tumor detection. That's incoming and actually quite exciting. In terms of breast imaging, there's new tomos. People are working on laser detection. There's quite of a interesting studies looking at estrogen receptor signaling. There's PSMA PET for prostate cancer. There's hyperpolarized magnets for pancreatic cancer. There's actually a lot of work is going on. Unfortunately, nothing is quite ready for you to go and do this tomorrow. But I think I also would like to put a plug in for those who know me will know that I always do that. There's a lot of evidence that lifestyle choices probably are relevant for people with BRCA mutation. That includes a normal weight, that includes exercise, that for pancreatic cancer, absolutely smoking and alcohol are detrimental. And I, more so than everything, is like every day counts, folks. You gotta just have a good outlook on every day. It's like, I feel very strongly you should not be angry anymore. It's like, because if you see our patients with cancer who are so gracious and that's the attitude that I love so much about Raleigh. Raleigh is always upbeat, and I think it's really important that that every day counts and that no day spent in anger.
I love that. Thank you. So Josh, when people leave here today and they're eager to speak to a genetic counselor, where do you recommend is a good place to start?
Yeah, I keep saying good questions, but I think they're all good questions.
Hey, I love that.
I'm always happy to answer them as well. So there's a couple different ways. So the easiest way is honestly, you can go and type into Google and go to it's called the National Society of Genetic Counselor page. And on there, they have specifically a way to find a genetic counselor in your area. So every genetic counselor is in that section. So you can click find a genetic counselor, type in your area and be able to find a genetic counselor that way. They'll pop up with names in your area. You'll be able to, either message them, call them, or figure out an office number for them to contact as well. Also, another way to go about it is oftentimes primary care physicians are oftentimes, should be aware of at least a local genetic counselor in their area as well. So you can always talk to your, primary care physician as well, talking about, is there a genetic counselor you know of? Can I get a referral to go see them as well? So I think the easiest way, oftentimes, because, we all have phones nowadays, we all have iPads, things like that as well, to be able to type into Google, like I said, it's called the National Society of Genetic Counselors. They have a Find a Genetic Counselor page. You can go on that page, you can find one, locally, as well as, like I said, oftentimes primary care physicians can be a great local resource as well, as oftentimes they're tapped into your specific region in terms of saying, oh, this is the local genetic counselor as well. I know this is mostly for the Contra Costa region, but specifically in this region, I think John Muir is, one of the most local ones in terms of the genetic counselors here. So I'm part of a great team here. It's me and two other genetic counselors as well. But there's also, I believe now, a genetic counselor in the Berkeley area. There's some in Oakland. So there's still some, like I said, absolutely phenomenal genetic counselors all in this region, as well as throughout the entire, Bay Area and all around, the United States as a whole. So something that I think everyone, is fantastic. So I'd always love to see, everyone as well, but also, I'm sure every genetic counselor as well, you know, they're trained and they do a phenomenal job as well. So I'd always be happy, and I think everyone would be too. So I always
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned all of those resources, because actually one of our volunteers on our committee compiled a list of different resources, some of which you mentioned. And then there are a few more on there, including Sharsheret does have a genetic counselor on staff. And so a lot of people who aren't ready to talk to their doctors about it, or aren't ready to have their insurance know that they're, you know, scheduling an appointment, you can always start with a confidential consultation with our genetic counselor, and then she can help, you know, connect you to all the resources that Josh just mentioned. But we will be putting in, my colleague Jessica is going to put in the chat a flyer that we created of all of her research. This will also be emailed out to all of you. So don't feel like you have to click it now. Just know that it exists and it's coming to an inbox near you. Raleigh, to close out our panel portion of the evening, what do you want to make sure everybody walks away from here today knowing about being a carrier for a hereditary mutation?
Well, you said it, Amy, when you said knowledge is power. You know, I don't want anybody else to learn by chance or a dog the way I did about their genetic mutation. I want to make sure that people know this is a really personal decision, and depending on your age or your genetic history, it is a really different risk for everyone. And so everybody has to make that own, you know, choice. They may not want to be tested. They may not take the drastic measures that I took if they find out that they're positive. But what I hope that people will know is that that information and the education is so important so that you can make your own informed decisions about what you want to do for your own health. And that I hope you will take the information that you learned tonight and you will share it with your families. You will share it with your aunts and your uncles and your cousins and your brothers and your sisters and your children and your grandchildren. And you will tell them that anyone can have a BRCA mutation, that if you are an Ashkenazi Jewish descent, that your risk is 1 in 40. You'll tell them that men and women can both be positive. You will tell them that there are fertility options for those people who haven't yet gotten pregnant and want to learn more, because you don't have to pass this mutation on. And you will tell them that there are incredible doctors like Dr. Pamela Munster, who is doing great work to make sure that there are better screenings, that there are better preventative options, and there's better care. You know, having a BRCA mutation and having to go in to do surgery the way I did, I was fortunate to be able to do, but it's not an option that I want my daughter to have to face. And I know that with time and research, that there will be much better options for our children and for our grandchildren.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was such a beautiful way to end. And you actually said a lot of the things that I was planning to say in my closing. So I'm so glad that everybody got to hear it from you in such an eloquent, positive light. We've learned so much from all of you tonight. We have so many questions. I cannot believe how active the chat box was this whole time. So please know I have copied all of your questions. I will save the chat. We will get these questions answered, but definitely not tonight, because we don't want to be here till 10 p.m. So before I begin the Q&A portion, I just want to mention that Sharsheret is trying to understand the effects of types of programs like these, so we can make them even more effective and helpful. To that end, we will be including a link to a short survey in the chat. You will not be added to our email list because you click that link, but you do have the option to opt into it. This is an easy, confidential way to help us continue to provide free support. So thank you in advance for clicking that. Okay, so we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can, but like I said, we're not finishing them all. So just know that I will be following up in an email. We've talked a lot about, you know, the main cancers that are associated with these gene mutations. Josh, can you speak a little bit about other cancers? We've gotten so many questions about different cancers. Bladder cancer was very popular in the questions we got. Colon cancer was already touched on a little bit tonight. Lymphoma, leukemia, and even anal cancer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for at least for these genes, or like I said, for these cancers specifically, oftentimes there are genes that are associated with these cancers that have been mentioned. So for the colon cancer, for bladder cancer, or anal cancer, there are genes that are associated with these cancers. They're not always these BRCA genes. Those are not ones that we currently know are associated with them. But as I mentioned when we talk about genetic testing, is we oftentimes talk about what's called multi-gene panel testing. So that means that we know of a lot of different genes that are associated honestly with a lot of different cancers. So absolutely, for colon, for bladder cancer, like I said, for these other cancers, oftentimes we do know of genetic components for them. With that being said, though, not all cancers have some genetic component involved. As Dr. Munster had mentioned earlier, for breast cancer, it's currently thought that about 5 to 10% of breast cancers have some genetic component. That's similarly for colon cancer, 5 to 10%. And it really varies per cancer. For ovarian cancer, actually, that number is thought to be closer to be 20 to 25% of ovarian cancers have some genetic component involved. So it's just to simply say that, for a lot of these different cancers, there can be genetic components involved, but I always use that word can because just because, you have that cancer doesn't mean that there's always some genetic component. Sometimes cancer is simply just due to what we call sporadic factors, just meaning it's an accumulation of a lot of different things over one's lifetime that can lead to an individual actually having cancer. And sometimes it's not genetically related whatsoever, but something rather just, like I said, just due to a lot of different factors over one's lifetime. So it's to say, absolutely, for these other cancers that you mentioned, absolutely there are genetic components, but it doesn't always mean that, that there is some genetic component that is there for that specific individual cancer.
Thank you. Dr. Munster, can you speak a little bit about the wisdom study? We got a few different questions about this, and someone who's watching tonight is actually participating through UCSF.
The wisdom study was designed with the goal that do we do excessive screening and imaging in women, and do we not do sufficient screening and imaging in other women? So in going back to the idea that if you have a BRCA 1 or 2 mutation, you should start screening at 25. Obviously, a mammogram starting at 50 is not going to serve anyone with a BRCA mutation, right? On the other hand, someone with no family history of cancer and no mutation, we may not need to do a mammogram. Maybe you're starting at age 35 or 40, as some areas still do. So there's this uncertainty. So the wisdom trial randomizes women into either doing extensive gene testing and screening versus not. As I said, I have mixed feelings for the wisdom study, because in a high-risk population like Ashkenazi Jewish, I would much rather see every woman have genetic testing, and if you have a BRCA mutation, get appropriately screened rather than randomized to genetic testing versus not. But at the same time, I don't want to sound unsupportive of the wisdom study, but as I said, I would have been poorly served with a randomization to not getting genetic testing done, because particularly from a family, as I said, coming from a very small family with no Ashkenazi Jewish background, for me, having a mutation was not quite as readily understandable, and I would have not been picked up. And needless to say, none of my healthcare provider actually felt very strongly about me doing BRCA testing, and I didn't qualify. So I think just want to drive home how much my life and more importantly, the life of my father, who had pancreatic cancer, lived 6 years with it, had really been impacted by this mutation. And I think I really had 6 extra years with my father because I knew he had a BRCA mutation. I would not miss this. Mm-hmm. So I think the wisdom study is an important study for high risk population. I still would think it'd be better to do genetic testing.
Mm-hmm. Josh, we got a couple questions about medical insurance. So one is, what implications you know, happen with your insurance if you do test positive. And another is, you know, what if my insurance won't cover genetic testing because I'm not actually deemed high risk? What do people do in those situations?
Absolutely. So I'll start with what can be the implications for if you have a positive result. So there was actually a federal law that went into place in 2008. It's called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is a long name, but it's simply just important that you guys know what it means or what it says. And what the law stated was that for your medical insurance and for your occupation, they cannot use your genetic information against you. So if you had a positive result, came back, say in one of these BRCA genes, and it says you're at an elevated risk, like I said, for your medical insurance, for your occupation, they do not have the ability to use this information. However, what this law did not cover was specifically life insurance and long-term and disability insurance. So what the law stated is, say you currently have a plan, you know, a life insurance policy and set in stone. So if you were to go get genetic testing, well, they can't immediately then use that information against you. Your policy is already there, so it's set in stone. But what the law stated was that if you had a positive result and then you went to go update that life insurance, or say you wanted new additional life insurance, that they then would have the ability to use that information against you by being able to say, okay, have you had genetic testing? Okay, I see that you tested positive. Well, therefore, they may be able to charge you more, may be able to, you know, flat out deny you a plan as well. So in terms of, like I said, the medical insurance and the job, thankfully that is covered, you know, nothing that they could ever use against you. But in terms of the life insurance and long-term and disability insurance, that is something that is not covered at this point in terms of if you went to go get a new plan or update a current plan. In terms of, though, for the genetic testing, say you go and get insurance and, you know, or go and get genetic testing, I should say, and your insurance says, you know what, we're not going to cover it. What I will say is that most of the labs that we order through nowadays have what we call, you know, these patient assistance programs to be able to say, to limit that cost of actually how much genetic testing is. So most labs have an out-of-pocket cost of about $250 nowadays. So most labs that we order through now have that $250 number to say, if it isn't covered by your insurance, well, we're only going to charge you that $250 number. And as I mentioned, some of these labs have what are called patient assistance programs as well to say, well, if you make within a certain amount of money, and to say, you know, if you are getting even charged this $250, well, they'll actually sometimes even drop that number even lower than just that $250 number. So thankfully, a lot of insurances have come a long way in terms of covering genetic testing, but absolutely we still run in, you know, into roadblocks sometimes with insurance. But thankfully, genetic testing, at least in terms of the cost, has greatly lowered over the last, you know, 10, 20 years as well. So thankfully, we're down to $250, and hopefully that number can only continue to go down in terms of, you know, the price that a patient can, you know, be charged. But something that at least currently right now, that number is that $250 number.
So actually, Caller has family testing for $50. If you have a family member with a mutation, your family can get tested for $50.
And going off of that too, a lot of these labs have, oftentimes if you have someone who has a genetic mutation, they'll do what's called familial studies, and they'll test family members oftentimes for free if one family member has had it as well. So it's that $250 number oftentimes, like I said, for individuals who, you know, are freshly new, I guess, to getting it. But absolutely, if you have a family history, Dr. Munster is absolutely correct in saying that there are other options that can be cheaper as well, actually.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is a question for both Dr. Munster and Josh. We got a few questions about some other genetic mutations that we haven't touched on yet tonight. The Braf mutation, its implications and non-surgical treatment options, and also variants of the genetic mutations that we've talked about tonight, like K169ON. But I know there are lots of variants, so we can, you know, kind of talk about that. Whichever one of you wants to. Yes, Josh.
I'll talk about the variants first, and I'll leave the BRAF up to Dr. Munster to talk about. I could talk about as well, but I'll leave that up to her. In saying that for these variants is that Dr. Munster's talked about it earlier today, but that for all of these genes that we have, well, they all have possible different variants that do exist. And so for that specific variant, I won't lie, I do not know which gene that is in. Also, I'm not aware of, you know, what specifically that is. So I'll have to do more research specifically to learn about that one, and I can always get back to you as well. But in terms of for these variances, variant simply means that it's a genetic change that's out of the ordinary. And that's because we all have different genetic changes between us, but they're all just what make us, you know, unique for the most part. Maybe they make our hair color a little bit different, or eye color a little bit different. But having genetic changes isn't always a bad thing. So occasionally, you know, when we find genetic changes, they are out of the ordinary, but occasionally, you know, we don't know what they do. We don't know what all genetic changes in our body do. So occasionally we can find variants of what we call uncertain significance. Simply what that means is that there are genetic changes that are out of the ordinary, but we're not sure at this point whether it's actually causing that gene to not function correctly, which what we call a positive result, or whether it's actually just, unique human variation, all just what making us a little unique, and it's actually more likely to be a negative result. So like I said, for that specific variant, I promise you all, like I said, look it up and get back to you as well. But specifically for these variants is to say that, thousands and thousands of different variants are possible. And sometimes we don't even know what all variants do in all of these genes that we're testing for. So sometimes we just say they're uncertain.
Absolutely. And Dr. Munster, if you want to say something about the Braf mutation.
Yeah, Braf mutation is actually an important mutation in many cancers, foremost of all in melanoma. It's typically a mutation that's only seen on the tumor, not one that's get passed on or inherited. It helps us select different treatment options for melanoma, sometimes colon cancer, and there's a very rare form of leukemia, hairy cell leukemia, which is 90% BRAF positive, where we give BRAF inhibitors specific medications. And then Josh, I really like your explanation about the variant of unknown variant of unknown significance. I mean, the challenge is like people really struggle with this, and it's not just the variant of unknown significance. It's like if you have a strong family history, but you don't know where it's coming from, it's really difficult. So I actually have to say it's not a great thing to have a Brca mutation, but it's a good thing for me to have a Brca mutation, because for my daughter, she either has it, in which case she gets screened, or she doesn't have it, and then she's what we call the true negative, meaning my breast cancer risk is not passed on to her, so her breast cancer risk should actually be same as a population or lower. Whereas if your mother died at 35 of breast cancer and you have no idea where it's coming from, we cannot make any prediction for the offsprings, and so the cancer risk in the family linked to a mutation is actually something really reassuring. And so, and in the words of my son, is like, who recently found out he has a Brca mutation, he was saying like, well, a good thing you didn't know that you had a mutation, otherwise you may not have had me. So Raleigh, I feel like I'm with two souls in my chest about the genetic testing and the pre-implantation diagnostics, because we all hear and we feel like our life is important, right? And so not having had us because you could choose. As I said,
it's that all the time. Absolutely.
It's very difficult. And I have to say, one of the interesting things, I have really interesting discussions with our young children. And I think Amy is like maybe interesting to have one of the younger generations on a panel next time to get a little bit more perspective how the kids see this. Is like
Absolutely. I love that idea. And in the survey that we are sending out, we are asking everybody to share ideas for future panels and future programs. So I love that idea. And if anybody else has any other ones, I'd love to hear that too. Well, I feel like I could sit and chat with you all night. But I do see our participant numbers are going down. So I think we should save the rest of the Q&A questions for that follow-up email. But I just have to thank all the members of the panel, all the members of the committee, everybody who's joined us tonight, for making this evening such a success. I really am just so touched by everything that everyone said, and I feel like I've learned so much. The one question that we have gotten a few times, even though I did hear our panelists speak on this, is should people who are older, 60, 65 and above, still consider genetic testing? So let's do that one last question and then we'll close it out.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Perfect. Short and sweet. And absolutely anybody who's looking for more information, you can connect with Sharsheret's genetic counselor. You can connect with Josh. You can connect with all the different genetic counselors on the resource page that we are going to share. So thank you all so much. I've learned so much tonight. I know everybody's probably learned a lot tonight. And I know that just like Raleigh said, we all have family and friends who, we should have this conversation with and share at least one or two things that you learned tonight. And then also I'll be sending out the recording of this event in the next week or so. And so feel free to share the recording, because like I said, we are in all 50 states, and this information is helpful for people around the globe. If you are due for any healthcare screenings, mammograms, genetic testing, or even the dentist, I know we're all a little overdue this year because of COVID and worries about that, but please know that doctors' offices, dentists, everybody like that is a COVID-safe environment. They're all taking it more seriously than anybody else, and it is time to reschedule those appointments that you may have missed. And please get in touch if there's ever anything that Sharsheret can do for you. We're here for everybody, regardless of background. So don't hesitate to get in touch. And now Jackie has some closing words to share. Thank you all so much.
Hello, and on behalf of all of our wonderful sponsors, I'd like to thank our panel members. Dr. Pamela Munster from UCSF Brca Research Center. By the way, I saw you on NOVA a few months ago. I really enjoyed seeing you in that program. Josh Barnhart, our genetic counselor from John Muir Hospital, one of 3, as you said. I look forward to getting to know you. And Raleigh Zwerin, I really appreciate your coming on and telling your personal story. I also want to thank Amy Sachs, of course, from Sharsheret for her invaluable input into our Under 110 program this evening, and most of all to you, our community, for attending this very important discussion on hereditary genes. I trust that you've learned something new about genetics, and although the conversation was predominantly an Ashkenazi Jewish issue, we need to educate our families, friends, and the community about how we can prevent this mutation in future generations and how testing is readily available. This is a very important public health issue that needs to be addressed. Please note where you can go for your genetic testing and counseling. And as Amy mentioned, you'll be getting more information if you've not already taken the information from the chat. Again, thank you for your participation this evening. And for further information about upcoming Under 110 programs, please contact Under 110 at Contra Costa, Under 110 at ccjcc.org. Good night, stay well, and keep smiling.
Thank you all so much. Take care.
Amy, very nice work. As usual.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jackie. Amy is such a pro at this. Is really nice.
I know she is. She's a natural.
No, it's like and it's nice to be a panelist with you. You never ask questions that I go like, oh shoot, what do I say now? It's like
Yes,
you all are the pros.
Kidney cancer is also part of this issue.
yeah, so thank you. You all stay safe, okay?
Thanks, you too.
Thanks again.
I said, thank you for letting me be a part of this. It was great. So thank you.
That
So
was
much.
great, Josh.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. You too, Dr. Munster. I appreciate it. You too, Raleigh.
Thanks, Josh.
I
Thanks,
appreciated
Pam.
all you guys as well. So thank you. It's been great.
Thank you.
Wonderful program.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.